John, if you are, please give us a wave. And Jeremy, Meek, um,
I'm here. Hello.
wonderful. Hello, both of you. John, a education leadership mentor and an ex-CEO, and Jeremy, the CEO of Kite Academy Trusts, and we'll be talking today about their leadership journeys and some of their tips and tricks. And I'm sure they'll be echoing some of the things that already were mentioned in the previous session. Like I said, my name is Imanta. I'm the Content and Insights Research Manager at Edurio, working on our survey content, thinking about how to help our customers get the most out of the data that they collect through our surveys. And the agenda for today's session, we'll start with some data on what are staff saying about these questions about leadership dynamics. I'll share a little bit about our Edurio Leadership Guide, which we published a few weeks ago, where we highlight the stories of some of these top scoring leadership teams, looking for those kind of concrete best practice examples of what can we do better as leaders for our organizations. And then finally, we'll open the floor with a discussion with John and Jeremy about their approach to leadership, some of their takes on what we see in the data, and then they'll share some of their tips and tricks with you. Let's get started. What are staff currently saying on these questions on this topic of leadership dynamics? We have, from our mid-year benchmark, in the past academic year, over 25,000 staff responses giving us their take on the situation currently. And one of the things that was mentioned in the previous session is that importance of leadership in building the work culture, in helping staff to feel valued, to have that sense of purpose and belonging within the organization. And so we asked this question: how appreciated by the leadership do you feel for your work? And here we see that midway through this last academic year, 45% feeling completely or very appreciated by the leadership for the work that they do, and almost a quarter, 24%, feeling only slightly appreciated or not appreciated at all. If we think about how the leadership should be in tune with their staff and with their community, it's critical that leadership should know the challenges and the needs of the staff body. They should be taking them into account and finding solutions to improve the work setting for their staff. And so we look at the question: how confident are you that the leadership actively work to address your professional needs? And here we see again, 39% feeling completely or very confident in the leadership, that they're actively working to address their personal needs, and 28%, a little bit over a quarter, saying that they feel only slightly confident or not confident at all that the leadership is working to address these needs. And finally, a big part of leadership is how we approach communication and being good at managing communication channels across the organization. And that includes listening to staff. I think Sufyan said it, that means hearing staff. So it's not just about collecting some sort of feedback, but it is also kind of processing it and taking it into account. And then it's a critical part to that is feeding those decisions back to your staff. And along the way, making sure that this is transparent, you have clarity in decision-making processes, so that your staff know and trust the processes and how decisions are made. And so we asked the question: how often do you see that your feedback to the leadership has an impact? And so this implies all of these things. This implies that leadership asks staff for their feedback. This implies that the leadership process and do something with the feedback, and has impact means that something comes out of it. There is some sort of end result or some sort of impact that you see. And here we see 34% of staff say that they always or often see that their feedback to the leadership has an impact. And again, around that quarter, 26% saying that they rarely or never see that their feedback to the leadership has an impact. And as we started going through this data, and we heard from our customers that, what does leadership mean? What does good leadership look like? We set out to kind of ask our customers, ask our top scoring customers, and collect some of these best practice examples on what does good leadership look like? What are good leaders doing? And so to find what's going on in our data, we looked at all of the customers who had included the leadership dynamics questions within their staff survey, and then we looked at which customers are currently the top scoring teams within these questions. We narrowed that list down to the top 15, and finally we got about 13 distinguished leaders across 8 trusts to join us in interviews and discussions, sharing their stories with us. And these interviews took place across trust and school level leadership. So in some cases, we had a school head talk to us. In some cases, we had the trust level leadership talk to us. And in some very wonderful situations, we had both. And those were some great opportunities for I think, them to be in the room together and to celebrate one another's achievements, and to really kind of reflect on how they support one another in this leadership journey. The guide focuses on four main sections. We asked the contributors, okay, how do you describe your leadership structure, your leadership style? We asked them to think about some of the practices that they've put in place and kind of reflect on the impact that those practices have brought. We asked them to describe their challenges and solutions, and finally to give some advice to other leaders reading this guide, looking to improve their practice. And in the conclusion of the guide, we have some final words from the Ambition Institute and great top tips for systems leaders by John Murphy, which John will speak to about a little bit later in this presentation. And now I'll go to some of those stories that we had in our guide, referring to kind of the 3 pieces of data that I shared in the beginning. So how can we show appreciation to our staff? What does that look like in practice? And the first example comes from the Pinnacle Learning Trust. And one of the things that they do is to find ways to create a consistent approach across all their academies. And they have specific cross-trust groups where people responsible about a certain topic come together to work on these initiatives. And for this staff appreciation, they have a staff engagement group, which focuses specifically on the social and well-being activities for staff. And these people come together and they can share their best tips and practices with one another. They also mentioned an internal leadership training program. So showing appreciation means also investing in your staff and in your people. And they spoke to the impact that this has helped develop a sense of leadership for staff across every level, no matter their role. And they spoke to the fact that these training sessions have led to positive evaluations, clear career progression, and a great takeaway was that they had higher internal staff retention and promotion. And their approach to all of this was being responsive. So the example that they say is that we have to be responsive to all individual concerns. We have to take all of those individual concerns into account. But we have to be nuanced and balanced with knowing what are the bigger implications for the wider community. And so we have to acknowledge that we have listened to all of these concerns, we have listened to our staff, but we also have to explain and kind of communicate transparently how decisions are made, upon which concerns can we take actions and which we can't, and really reinforcing the trust of the process and decision-making process, so that there's clear understanding among the staff and stakeholders how decisions are made. When it comes to actively addressing professional needs for their staff, a great example came from the Tiffin Girls School. And they were really addressing this challenge about how can we balance workload and well-being for our staff. And the quote that really sticks to mind is the fact that, okay, the teacher is the teacher. They have a clear job description. They have to do some things that pertain to their job description. They have to do preparation and they have to do marking. But outside of that, what can they, as an organization, how can they kind of alleviate some of those other pressures that they're faced with? And the solution that they put forward is what they described as creative timetabling. And it was really clear that they were focused on what things they could take out of this workload to relieve the workload, and what things could they build into the timetable to make make staff feel that they have time for the purposeful work that they want dedication to. So they reduced the number of assessment points, they reduced the number of reports staff had to write, they kept parents' evenings online. So these were some of those examples about what they could take out of that timetable to alleviate some of that pressure. But they built in time for purposeful work, especially around staff appraisal preparation. And they said to staff, okay, take this half inset day to do this preparation. And by building that time in to the timetable, they really communicated to the staff that this is important and that they care that staff have the time to really think about their appraisal preparation and give time to that. Finally, how can we ensure that staff feedback has impact? And the example comes from Infinity Academy's Trust, where similar to the first example from Pinnacle, they have a role within each academy of this staff champion. And these staff champions come together to collaborate with one another and with the CEO to pinpoint and address these work-related concerns for staff. And one of the concerns that had come up was that oftentimes within the rush of the day, staff leave the day feeling that they haven't had a time for a bite to eat. They haven't made it to the cafeteria to eat lunch. They're feeling kind of low energy and they have a hard time to keep going. And one of the schools decided to start a donation snacks box program in staff rooms. So any staff member could grab a bite to eat, boost their energy to keep going throughout the day. And by coming together with the other academies and sharing this among the other staff champions, this practice was kind of lifted and shared across the other schools within the trust. And the other element that they mentioned here for making sure that staff feedback has an impact is really thinking about your channels of communication and how we can use them to make the most of what we're trying to say. So that first starts with making sure that leadership is accessible within the schools, but also using digital communications to your advantage. That digital communications in our day and age, they really do play a role in sustaining the fabric of our community. And so the example that they share is that the trust CEO weekly emails the 500 staff members to not only share these updates, but also uses that as a very purposeful platform to acknowledge achievements, to reinforce the message that everyone is part of this united effort. And so by being very mindful and purposeful about how we're using these communication channels, being clear on what you will receive and how we can listen to one another and hear what's going on within the trust, that kind of communication really plays a big part in seeing that the feedback has an impact. So that's a quick overview of some of the things you can find within our Edurio Leadership Guide. I'd like to now invite John and Jeremy into the conversation, sharing some of their tips for system leaders, and starting with an introduction from both of you about your leadership journeys and how you've gotten here. A quote from Steve Munby about leadership. So leadership is about trying to do the right thing for the organization within the context that you find yourself and doing it in the right way. Naturally, there are days when we get it wrong, but if we are learners, then we can try to get it right tomorrow. So maybe there are also some things that you got wrong along the way that you learned from, and maybe you could also speak to your relationship, how you've worked together up until now.
Will I kick off, Imanta?
Yes. Yeah.
So thank you very much for the invite. And I know many people on the call, so I know many people know me well, so I'll just be very brief in terms of introduction. My name's John Murphy. I'm now a CEO mentor working with numerous trusts across the country, supporting and giving direct support to leaders, deputy CEOs and CEOs. I've had 7 headships in primary, secondary and special, and I thought that would be a great preparation for being a CEO. Little did I know. Because for the last 10 years, I've run Oasis Community Learning. We had 32,500 children, and we had 5,000 staff across, in the end, 54 sites. And when I took the organisation on, it was in a very poor state. There were 27% schools good or better, 27% good or better. And in that, if you think about that, there were many uncomfortable truths. And I think I just want to connect very much to what Emma said in her introduction about a higher purpose, and also going back to what Sufyan said about culture, that we have a precious job and we have to connect to the purpose and the culture of the organization. And inside that word culture is the word cult. How do we do things around here? And so I'd challenge, I suppose, Imanta, in what you said about tips, because I think this has to be almost be the absolute the golden thread of everything we do, how we behave, how we act, and the sort of culture that we want to create in our organization. So I think that I spent many years, I could spend about 5 years, I think, getting it wrong. And I was improved in the second 5 years. But I think what we need to do is we need to think about the vision, the purpose, the strategy, the outcomes of what we're doing, but know that we're trying to create organizations for the long term. So it's not about short term strategy, it's about really embedding everything we do and making sure that our values become a reality. So that's, and I went on to found the NIOT. I did that deliberately because I see the relationship between learning and development and curriculum, and actually those two things being the things that will lift education for all children. But I'll pass across to a wonderful colleague I've been working with very well as well, and you'll hear that there's probably quite a lot of similar messages from both of us. Over to you, Jeremy.
Morning, everybody. Imanta, thank you for inviting me along this morning. Colleagues on the call, it's a pleasure to meet with you all. So I'll just do a brief introduction and give you an overview of my background in education. So I've now been in education for 17 years. In that time, I've had accountability at a headship level and above for 20 schools. I became an assistant head teacher 14 years ago, and in between my appointment and starting at the school that I was appointed as an assistant head teacher, which happened to be in a high area of deprivation, the school went into special measures. And the head teacher ended up leaving very shortly after I arrived. I was then very soon after starting my journey as an assistant head teacher appointed as the head teacher of a special measures school. But just under 3 years later, the school received a good grading across the board from Ofsted. And in that time, it moved from the bottom of the local authority league tables to the joint top. I then moved on to my second headship, which was in four-form local authority school that the local authority had graded as requires improvement. And I'm not sure if there are any colleagues on the call who remember Raise Online. For those who do, the Raise Online for this school was littered with blue boxes, which wasn't the colour that you wanted to see. But the school went on and we were fortunate enough to gain a good grading by Ofsted in all areas. I'd found that I'd been well and truly bitten by the school improvement bug. So I, in 2016, went on to join a South London-based multi-academy trust, which at the time had 5 academies. And I was part of the leadership team as it grew to 20 academies. And I ended up taking a lead on 6 of those academies at an executive level during my time there. The trust was called STEP, and soon after I joined, I became responsible for 2 schools that had gone into special measures and had just joined the trust, and both went on to gain a number of outstanding elements at their first inspections, fortunately including leadership and management. I had many trust-wide responsibilities at STEP, including safeguarding, career pathways and sustainability. So I'm a relatively new CEO. I became the CEO of the Kite Academy Trust in September of this academic year. It's a 10-school primary-only multi-academy trust with 2,500 children and 403 colleagues. During the last academic year, the trust unfortunately received 2 inadequate Ofsted judgments, which I knew about before I applied. However, many of the team who were part of the trust previously, along with 7 new additions we've made, all of whom were known to me, have absolutely transformed the Kite, and we're now securing some wonderful Ofsted outcomes, and the entire team have really embraced the one team culture we've introduced and are embedding, as well as our aligned ways of working, including an aligned curriculum. And it really is resulting in significantly improved metrics across the trust, which go well beyond Ofsted outcomes and include successes such a reduction of 50% of staff turnover when compared to this point in the last academic year. I think it's really important and to highlight that my role in those improvements really has been minimal, as it is all down to the colleagues in the schools and the trust who really do all of the wonderful work. But my role as CEO and executive leader, I have always seen it in any position I've had, primarily to have the right people in the right positions who are then incredibly well supported, developed, valued, and empowered, and also have any significant barriers to their roles removed. As John touched upon, his vision and ethos has always been around a shared vision and aligned strategy. That's exactly the same philosophy and method that I've taken in school leadership. But it really does sound incredibly simple and potentially a bit cliche. But by having an aligned vision and strategy alongside maintaining a relentless focus on your people, as well as the children and their education, it does seem to work and get results for colleagues and children. So there's a brief overview of my background in education. It's a pleasure to be here, everybody.
Wonderful. Maybe John, could you speak to the program? I think CST, the CST brought you and Jeremy together in a more formal collaboration, if I understand correctly. Could you give us a little bit of overview? What is the kind of the goal of that support relationship that you give to Jeremy and to others?
Yeah, I think after 10 years in Oasis, we managed to take 45 schools to good or outstanding, but we've put the organisation in a really good place. And so I stepped away in September, and Leora and I together constructed a program which involves some other CEOs too, in supporting CEOs in a contextualised context. So what we do is we support directors of education, deputy CEOs, and there is a program which provides 56 hours of strategic support. The first day, for example, is where you do a reading day to make sure that you understand. You don't wait, you turn up asking lots of silly questions. The second day is where you go around with the CEO and you look at their schools, the internal variance between their schools and how they're operating. And then what we do is we spend some time really getting to know each other. And then there's an action plan that we draw out over a period of time. But instead of going to a course where you might be able to pick up 20% of context, this is all very much focused on the CEO. And I think I've been blessed to work with Jeremy, to spare his blushes, because he's picked up on so many things and I've learned so much in the same way. So it's very much an exchange of professional dialogue and narrative, but there's very much direct challenge and support around. We're both seeing things, and it is different to coaching. So I've been coached before, but sometimes you end up doing is giving your own version of reality as opposed to seeing and triangulating that reality on the ground. I'll try to be as brief as possible, Imanta.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think that's something that's very important, that, you know, because you're in this top leadership role doesn't mean that you don't need help, doesn't mean you don't need that outside perspective. And by having these sort of programs that allow leaders to get that support, I think is really important and impactful to make sure that there is that community support at that level as well. Let's then move back kind of to those the sets of data that I shared, and I'd like to hear some of your reflections on them. Maybe you can talk to how can we show staff that leadership appreciate them for their work? How do we show staff that leadership actively are working to address their professional needs and challenges, and how can we show them that their feedback to leadership has an impact? And thinking kind of, you know, should we be focused on those bottom quarter, 1 in 4 staff members? Should we try to be getting them more positive? Should we be focusing on that middle bar, as Emma said, that, you know, sometimes it's okay to just be kind of okay? How do you look at the data and any reflections that you have on these areas?
Yeah, in anticipation of this session, myself and Jeremy will sort of set out a few holistic strategies. And I know that Jeremy wants to go into far more detail than I'm going to suggest. If I do some helicopter work, and then Jeremy sets out exactly what some of the practical implications of that on the ground. I think most importantly that every single trust has a different context. So in my previous context, we had 62% free school meal children in primary and 51% in secondary. So you're working in some really challenging areas in the country, mostly in a sponsored context. So people are absolutely precious and key. So I think trying to make sure that the staff understand that you understand the reality. So in other words, don't sit in an office, and I know it's really basic, but actually be on the ground in the academies on a very regular basis, see the reality through their eyes. When things aren't good enough, be prepared to listen and to make sure that you understand the reality with them and you're playing that back. Because I think that's the whole part of transaction analysis. Do people understand? Do you understand? And do they understand there's a shared reality there? The second thing is that in small or large organizations, if you're a teaching assistant, it's quite a powerless situation sometimes. So make sure that you're communicating and working with the whole organization about the role of communication and the pace of change. When are things happening? How are things happening? But as Sufyan said earlier, why are things happening? So you go almost to a third point that actually one of the few things that would raise the upward convergence of the whole organization. So there's a sense of de-implementation. Instead of doing lots of stuff, what are the few things you know that make significant difference to the work life of particular children? And I know Jeremy will go into this as well, but for years and years and years, I battled against the idea, for example, of standardizing operating processes or procedures. And as part of that is the curriculum. But I learned very quickly, and some of you will know me very well, that I had 52 schools with 48 curriculum, everyone doing everything differently, because I really believed in people's creativity and their agency. But actually, what I realized very acutely by 218 that I was letting people down, that actually we weren't really focusing with that precision on teacher development and research. We weren't, from an evidence base, trying to be in a situation where we were looking at the best evidence-based practices, like you'd get when you go to hospital. You just don't hope that that hospital is pretty good. You rely on the research. And we created a standardized curriculum, and we gave back thousands of hours to teachers so they could focus on pedagogy. It was quite funny, by the way, in the school I'm in, I asked if I could be in a quiet space, and they put me next to the sensory room. So if you hear squeals of delight, it's from the children next door, not from me in this room, just to say. And I think the other part of that, as you're going through these change processes, there's a sense of how do we listen to staff, but also how do we make staff part of the change? So, for example, we set up staff network groups, and I attended the groups, but I agreed not to speak in any of those groups because obviously, when the CEO turns up, sometimes it limits conversation. So people understood the parameters for the meetings, and we led staff networks around protected characteristics, for example, LGBTQ plus, anti-racism, disability, etc. And it was a really uncomfortable space because obviously people who are turning up to those meetings wanted change in the organization. And we had to do an awful lot of you said we did, but on a continual basis. But alongside that, what we also did was create project steering groups where there was going to be change in the organization. So people at every level of the organization, when you've got 5,000 staff, it's a big opportunity. But they knew then that they could be part of those major changes in how they were doing it. And I think the other part of it is transparency. When you're considering the life cycle of a member of staff in the organization, there's a sense that you want to attract and recruit people and make sure that as soon as they're recruited into the organization, they understand the routes and journeys they can take. In other words, what are the opportunities available to them? But also straight away, as soon as they come in, what is the learning and development that's available for them? And I think I go back to what Emma said, so many young teachers come out of the organization because they're not well catered for. In a normal PGCE, how much time is spent on mental health or SEND diagnosis? It might be behavior management, might be half a day in the module. It's just not good enough in terms of the professional training. So, how do you then onboard colleagues? How do you make sure they're inducted before they start, as opposed to inducted after they start, when actually some of the poorer habits may have already kicked in? How do you make sure that during probation people are thoroughly supported? And if you just look at L&D budgets across the country, they should be some of your major budgets because people are your biggest resource. But we just hope that they'll do well enough. How do we then create the appraisal, the learning and development systems underpinning it? How do we make sure that staff who, for example, have got real mastery in teaching and learning understand they don't have to go into management, but actually mastery of teaching and learning is just as valid? And finally, I suppose, how do we after that whole talent management process, really celebrate people's contribution to the organization. So I've spoken about a few helicopter processes, but they are very much how you run an organization overall, not as bringing in those smaller soft tips. I think they're generated by individual school communities rather than organizations. But with that, I'll be quiet and I'll pass across to Jeremy, who's wonderfully equipped with this.
Thank you very much, John. It's a fascinating data set, isn't it? To think that over 25% of colleagues don't feel valued or only feel slightly valued by leadership. I think from my experience, particularly when thinking about the questions around how appreciated colleagues feel and the impact of their feedback, having a really clear communication and feedback strategy in place can go really some distance to helping demonstrate to colleagues that we do value their work and that we do listen. Because as leaders, of course, we're always listening, and of course, we always value the work that our colleagues do. But the key thing for us as leaders is to actively demonstrate that we're listening and value their work at every opportunity. I think it's really all about the perception of our colleagues, isn't it? We know we value them and their work. How do we show it? How do we make sure they perceive that we're showing it? When I was an executive leader across multiple academies in my previous trust, I could take a great deal of personal and direct ownership over ensuring colleagues at every level in every academy felt valued by attending staff briefings, holding weekly head teacher meetings, attending joint PD. But very quickly that became clear in the CEO role, and this was a big bit of learning for me that we needed to deliberately design the culture that we wanted to embed across the trust. And even more so when moving into what was a relatively established organisation, we wanted and do make sure that every Kite colleague across the trust is recognised and praised for their work publicly and privately and at a local and trust level. I'm just going to give you an example of how specifically we've decided to do that at the Kite. So we've set up this year various different forums that always have a significant focus on sharing and celebrating our colleagues' work, including the introduction of a regular trust-wide leadership briefing, which involves all of our heads, executives, directors, and our quality of education team, which always has littered throughout the presentations and the briefings good news, praise, and personal and collective successes. We've expanded that out to a trust-wide level, and this academic year we've introduced what we call Kite Town Hall meetings, which I lead with our executive team, and every single one of our 403 Kite colleagues are invited to attend virtually, which means it doesn't matter if they're at home or if they're in a school, wherever they are, they can log in to Zoom and they can spend 30 minutes celebrating with us at a trust-wide level. And again, within that forum, we make sure that individual academy, business team, and trust good news is publicly shared and celebrated. And that's all really done in line with the one team ethos that we're embedding across the trust. And we try to link as many of those successes and good news stories to our aligned trust vision and our aligned trust strategy, so that hopefully colleagues can see very clearly the benefits of working towards a common trust-wide goal. When considering addressing staff's professional challenges, this academic year, we've introduced a bespoke and comprehensive trust-wide survey that we've written from scratch. And we also have various forums that we've set up and used to find out specifically from colleagues on the ground what professional challenges exist in their individual roles. So these forums always start by asking the same question, which is, what are the barriers you face to excellence in your individual role? Now, we've taken great care and time to frame these forums to make sure that colleagues feel psychologically safe, and we make sure that every colleague understands that anything they feed back is completely anonymized and doesn't go and sit on any meeting agendas and doesn't get fed into reports at a personalized level, and that we're only looking for key trends in roles across the trust and barriers to excellence. Now, what's been really interesting is quite quickly a number of these trends in terms of barriers to excellence have emerged from these forums, which we have then used to review and feed into our trust strategic plan so that we can be absolutely sure that we are addressing the most significant trust-wide professional challenges for colleagues. So how do we show then staff that we are listening to the feedback that they are providing? Well, we found that as leaders, essentially by holding ourselves to account very publicly, we're hopefully going some way to demonstrating a certain level of authenticity in our leadership and showing our colleagues that what they say is acted upon. And just to give you an example of how we're doing that at the Kite this year, we use a combination of that survey feedback that I spoke about and the forum feedback alongside some other very simple mechanisms to gauge colleague feedback, such as QR code systems in every PD session, which we then use to feed into a type of you said, we did feedback loop. So we collate the general trends from these specific forums and more widely across the trust, and then we publicly share those trends, and then we publicly share the actions that we are taking or are planning to take to address the barriers and trends that staff are giving us. In these regular forums that I've spoken about, we then revisit the actions that we said we were going to take to address the barriers so that staff can very clearly see, number one, we've listened. They can very clearly hear about the actions we're taking, and then we're regularly keeping them up to date around progress towards those actions. And just to give you one specific example around what that's looked like in the trust this year. So we introduced in the autumn term, because believe it or not, colleagues didn't get free tea, coffee or milk or sugar in any of our academies or business teams. So we quite quickly introduced that across the trust for every colleague. As part of that feedback loop, a number of colleagues came forwards and said, well, we don't actually drink tea or coffee. Could we have hot chocolate? So immediately we introduced free hot chocolate across the trust for every staff. And although that may seem like an incredibly small and potentially insignificant example, it is just one example of how you can show you're listening and acting upon staff's wants and needs. John, shall I hand back to you to carry on and continue?
I think you're doing great. Do carry on.
Okay, well, I think it's back. Is it back to you now, Imanta?
Yeah, I think we've already kind of started going into, and John started already talking a bit about the tips that he includes in the conclusion of our leadership guide. Maybe we can kind of shift to what do you think leaders should be thinking about? What should they be prioritizing? You already spoke to the kind of strategically thinking about the life cycle of a member in your organization, but maybe thinking about kind of that the de-implementation. What else can we do in that space, or any of these other tips that you have mentioned? What else could you highlight about these?
Let me just explore a bit. I think that the biggest relationship that we've got as leaders is with our people, not necessarily with our children. And I know that sounds odd to say. So I've visited a number of trusts in the last few weeks, and I might go between two schools, and there's wonderful, rich practice between those schools, and there are schools doing great work. But when I say, for example, have you shared this practice? Well, no, those children are different. And I absolutely balk at it at every single level now, having gone down this journey in terms of learning. If I were going to go and work with Rachel O'Hallahan, and I know Rachel very well, we've known each other for many, many years. If I was her NQT, I'd turn up and she would share with me, normally in a normal context, her lesson plans, her lessons, how she works. So to make sure between our two classes, if we were doing some joint teaching, that actually those children get the same quality of offer and equity. But what happens, I think, in school culture is that what we do is we play with all the stuff around the edges rather than being really bold, really courageous, and having a sense of understanding what are we trying to achieve from the vision that we're putting in place. Now, if we really believe in equity of offer, it means that you're doing the best things for all the children, and it means that you're being brave with adults. And I'll just say this as a normal example. Normally, what might happen is a head teacher goes into a classroom and they might tell a child off for misbehaving, rather than holding the adult to account for making sure the children behave. That's like a standard thing that happens in our school culture because we're not brave with each other. and we don't have, sometimes our children don't have the same citizenship rights as adults, but that's not in line with our values and what we're trying to achieve. So I think we need to be really brave. We need to be bold. We need to look back at our organizations and say, why don't we pick the best of what we're doing? And I'll use the analogy of dinner. Say, for example, I've got a big family, I've got 8 children. I'm not going to necessarily cook them 8 different dinners. What I'm going to do is use the best ingredients, use the best cooking, and get the best meal. I may have to differentiate a little bit, but actually, what I'm doing is I'm making sure that they get the best offer. That's what we should be doing in our organizations. But what stops them from doing that is being courageous about that sense of change and having that sense that if I've got these values, my values need to translate in my practice. If they're translating in that way, you are standardizing what happens. And that standardization saves me working as an NQT or as an experienced teacher all Sunday. Then suddenly I turn up fresher on a Monday, fresher on a Tuesday, fresher on a Wednesday, and I'm free in terms of my master in adaptive teaching around using some of the best resources because we're a profession. We're not a bunch of amateurs in every school reinventing the wheel. I'm sorry to say it that way, but that's why teachers are leaving because they're not well supported, they're not well trained. And I think that we need to be honest with ourselves and we need to be evidence based in our practice. And we need to have a sense of we need to develop the profession with that sense of voice. So that's my codified learning. But Rachel's learned me for years, so she's probably bored of hearing the same theory. But I do think it's fundamentally important.
Jeremy, do you have any more reflections to share? And then we
Yeah,
can
what
open it
I'll
to
do, if
the
it's okay, Imanta, is I'll just go through and give a specific example of how we
exactly awesome.
implemented these top tips at the Kite. So if we take top tip 1, which is to strategically consider the life cycle of our colleagues, what we've implemented at the Kite this year is people and culture strategy, which covers any future and current Kite colleagues. Now, the strategy essentially covers the 10 stages of what we call the life cycle of our colleagues and incorporates everything that we will do for our people, including specifying how we will advertise our roles, what our interview and offer process looks like, how we'll onboard every colleague, and how the induction process will be carried out and the content. It also includes the career pathways that we offer to every colleague across the trust, regardless of their position, and all of the associated PD internally and externally that we will and do implement for colleagues in their current roles, and the PD that they are likely to need if they're going to progress their careers within our trust. The people and culture strategy also maps out our approach to talent management, and it goes right the way through to how we will commit to treating a colleague when they leave the trust, whether it's after 1 year or after retiring after 30 years of great service to the trust. In terms of the top tip 2, which is understanding the honest reality of the organisation, well, this really for me just does come back to listening to staff. To understand, we have to listen and we have to be prepared as leaders to hear the very best bits about our schools and our trusts, but also be prepared to hear the worst. And we do have to show colleagues that we're listening. And again, it comes back to perception, doesn't it? We really do try to show that we value open and honest feedback from our colleagues, however challenging it can be and is to hear at times. And as part of our ongoing commitment to our people, I protect regular time in my diary to meet regularly with colleagues to hear about what they think we do well, what we need to be better at, and the barriers to excellence that I mentioned earlier. And it is truly fascinating and genuinely informative to sit and listen to colleagues from every single role, academy, business team around what they truly feel about the trust. As I mentioned earlier, these regular forums that I lead upon are used to complement the feedback we collect from that recently introduced staff survey, the first of which was primarily focused on wellbeing and workload. And as I mentioned earlier, that information is all collated to inform our future strategic plan. So we can demonstrate to colleagues that we really are listening and we're using what they say to make our trust, hopefully one of the very, very best trusts there is to work with and for. In terms of top tip 3, which is the role of communication, the pace of change, and the why, well, how have we adopted that tip at the Kite? Well, it's quite simple, really. We have one trust-wide strategic plan, which we've based on what we call the Kite Foundation Stones, that all senior leaders across the trust work from, so that we can all see what's coming and when it's coming. And we regularly collectively review and update the plan to make sure that we can all see and celebrate progress, and to make sure that we are making adjustments to the plan as necessary to ensure that the pace of change is managed very carefully. What we do know is in the absence of one strategic plan, whether you work in one academy or 2 or 10 or 20, we found it can be incredibly difficult to manage the pace of change at a trust level. In terms of our why, we have a shared trust why, if you like, which we see as being incredibly closely linked to our vision, which many of our colleagues have directly contributed towards co-creating this academic year. Which leads me directly on to top tip 5, which is about giving staff a voice and agency, because those 2 tips are very closely linked. So one of the very first steps that we took at the Kite was to engage a significant cross-section of colleagues from across the trust, again, from every academy, from every business team, to cover every role and level of responsibility to help co-create our trust values, which now work alongside our recently redefined mission and vision. And this was done via a trust-wide inset day, which I took a lead on. We felt that if we truly wanted to empower our colleagues to live our values and work towards a shared vision, and to support our pupils not only in their personal development, but to create, if you like, the optimal organisational culture for our people, engagement in the creation of our values and contribution towards our vision was paramount to us. So this would be one example of how we've given our colleagues really quite a significant voice in the direction of the trust. Finally, top tip 4, the education sector creates workload, so it's important to work on de-implementation. I'm going to give you some very specific examples around what we have done this year at the Kite. So we base absolutely everything we do on evidence and research, and we keep things incredibly simple. So to give you a brief idea of what that looks like at Kite, we've introduced a trust-wide curriculum and shared trust-wide PPA meetings, which mean we can share planning and means colleagues can spend time planning fewer lessons. And because they're planning fewer lessons, they can commit much greater amounts of time into the lessons they do plan. So simultaneously, what we're doing is we're reducing workload whilst increasing the quality of the planning. So our curriculum, our trust-wide curriculum, which we have designed from the very ground up, maps out all of the declarative and procedural knowledge that every single child we feel needs to know from the point that they enter one of our academies to the very end of year 6. And running alongside that curriculum, what we have done is we've introduced a PD schedule across the trust, whereby staff have a maximum of 40-minute sessions every week. None of it is admin. They are all absolutely focused on curriculum, subject knowledge, and pedagogy. And we have trained every staff member in a learning science informed pedagogy, which allows them to effectively deliver that curriculum. Now, I know John touched upon this, that when people hear the word alignment, they can see it as a dirty word, but when you have a curriculum that's progressively mapped from the ground up, and you've trained all of your teachers in a pedagogy that allows them to effectively deliver that curriculum, we can be fairly sure that every single one of our children is receiving a really good deal. And our teachers still get a huge amount of freedom within some clearly agreed parameters, because the really clever thinking that they do essentially is they take that curriculum, which we've co-created from the ground up, they've been trained in the principles of effective pedagogy, and they blend the two. We expect across the trust minimal marking in books. There are certainly no stars or wishes, and it's very rare to see books taken home by teachers. The primary way of us feeding back to children is at the point of learning, and we've trained all of our teachers in some very specific feedback strategies that they use in their classrooms. The curriculum that we've designed and implemented, it is a mastery curriculum, and we teach the majority. And if I give you an example of what that looks like, often you can walk into a classroom, can't you, and a writing lesson's been taught, and the expectation can be that the teacher then goes away and reads 30 books and puts potentially 30 different comments and next steps in the pupils' books. How's that manageable? It's just not manageable. The workload that creates is significant. And then there's no way that teachers can follow up on 30 different next steps. You just cannot do it. So what we expect and ask our teachers to do, and we train them in this strategy, is essentially they will deliver a writing lesson. They will then, they implement the feedback loops within the lesson, and then they read all of the writing that the children have produced, and they use that to inform their next day's teaching. Just a couple of other specific examples. We've centralised or are in the process of centralising most of our policies. So when I arrived at the trust, we had 10 different behaviour policies. Some were 2 pages long, some were 30 pages long. Head teachers were expected to rewrite those every year. We have now produced one evidence and research informed behaviour policy that each academy then produces an appendices for, which is 1 page long. And what we've been able to do, because we've aligned our curriculum and much of our PD and our processes and our procedures and our pedagogy, we've then been able to launch a trust-wide recruitment program. So what we're able to do is we're able to go out to advert for newly qualified teachers and more experienced teachers. And we can talk to them about what we will do for every single person who comes to work for our trust, because we have that trust-wide commitment to our people and our pupils. So in summary, what we've done is we've reduced workload and hopefully improved standards through the aligned curriculum and shared PPA and planning. We have stripped back marking in books. We do most of it at the point of learning in classrooms. We've got a mastery curriculum that we've introduced. We've centralised the majority of policies, and because of that level of alignment, we've been able to implement a centralised recruitment strategy across the trust, which again takes away a huge amount of workload from heads and leaders in the academies.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your practical kind of experience and sharing that with us. We have a few minutes left. Are there any questions or comments that maybe anyone joining us now would like to come off mute and pose to John or Jeremy? Please feel free to do that now. You can write it in the chat or just come off mute.
Jeremy, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
So just thinking about that centralised recruitment strategy, how do you think that you can scale that up to a larger trust?
I think it would probably depend on geography. So we're quite fortunate at this point in time that all 10 of our primary academies are within 30 minutes driving of each other. However, when we grow as a multi-academy trust and we expand into different regions, we will continue with that level of alignment. And essentially what we may well do is just create hubs. That I think the key thing is when you take John's helicopter principle, if you have the principles of alignment that exist across your trust, it wouldn't really matter where you were recruiting staff from or to, because you could use the same offer regardless of whether you're in Surrey, Hampshire, Newcastle, or the Midlands. It is a scalable model. It's one that I adopted when I was responsible for 2 academies, and we've taken it all the way to 10. We haven't seen yet any red flags that would prevent this model from being scaled to a more regional or national geographical area.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
I've got a question for Lee, if that's okay. I'll first of all say, who do you support, Lee? You need to make it slightly more sort of clear, I think.
We talk about authentic leadership, John. So this is me being authentic.
Fantastic. So yeah, I just think as we come to the end, Imanta, I just think it's really important to just focus on the part that context is key. Very much like Rachel was talking about. If you look working for the Unity Partnership, you know, it's a really large trust now. And actually, what you've got to do is contextualize strategy. But actually, the strategy doesn't matter. And I know that sounds an odd thing to say. What matters is making sure that the values translate to the reality. So if you can really focus on the vision, the mission, the values, the strategy comes. And actually, all the time, you know, you could have silent corridors, you can have noisy corridors. It all depends on the why you're doing that and what are the sort of people that you want on board to develop the equity for the young people, if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you to John and Jeremy for joining us on this leadership strategies session. Just a reminder of how the rest of the day and this People Power Day looks. We'll now take a break for lunch.